Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Um, so good morning or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm Joanna Lewis. I'm a professor here at Georgetown School of Foreign Service and director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program. And I've been working with the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues for a variety of projects related to U.S.-China climate change engagement, including dialogues and research efforts over the last several years, and very much appreciate their support for this event here today. It's, of course, a very interesting time in U.S.-China climate engagement. We are less than 2 weeks out now from the start of COP26, the next big round of international climate negotiations, where no doubt U.S.-China dynamics will be quite interesting to observe. Our two countries have many decades of history cooperating on climate and energy issues, and this became a focal point of the bilateral relationship under President Obama, and then dwindled to almost nothing under President Trump. Now, of course, the Biden team is navigating climate cooperation under an increasingly tense U.S.-China bilateral relationship. But once again, this is one of the more constructive areas I think we still see within the relationship. The special envoy for climate, John Kerry, has, of course, already been to China twice. He's had numerous dialogues with his counterpart, Xie Jinhua, who is also a longtime colleague and champion for the climate. You know, both of these diplomats have really made their country's climate legacies a cornerstone of their own careers. And yet we see far less science and technology cooperation now that there are significant concerns about competitiveness, supply chain security, IP theft, numerous other issues that are preventing the type of energy technology cooperation we had seen in the past. So where does this relationship really stand today? And are there still opportunities for U.S.-China cooperation in the climate and energy space? To discuss these questions and more, we have an all-star panel with us today, all who have participated directly in and are close observers of U.S.-China cooperation in the climate and energy space. And I'd like to introduce them all now, first starting with Li Shuo, who's a senior global policy advisor at Greenpeace China, based in Beijing. He leads the organization's engagement with multilateral environmental agreements, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. He is one of Beijing's closest and best informed observers of U.S.-China climate dynamics, so we are thrilled to have him here with us today. Next, Nan Zhou. Dr. Nan Zhou is a senior scientist and department head of the International Energy Analysis Department and the group leader of the China Energy Group at the U.S. Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Dr. Zhou is also the director of the presidential program, U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center's Building Energy Efficiency Consortium. And next we have Erica Thomas. Erica is the Senior Director of Policy for Environment, Sustainability, and Regulatory Affairs at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. She joined ITI after a distinguished career as a U.S. diplomat, where she focused primarily on environment, science, and technology issues. She served many years in Beijing, where she led the famous air pollution monitoring program that was pivotal in drawing worldwide attention to China's air pollution problem. And she also ran numerous ministerial level engagements, including the first U.S.-China SNED, the U.S.-China Innovation Dialogue, and the U.S.-China Joint Committee on Science and Technology, and was also directly involved in the negotiations leading up to the 2015 Paris Agreement. You can see their full, very distinguished bios on the event website. So thank you all so much for being here today, and let's get started with what I know will be a really important conversation. I'd like to start with a question to Li Shuo. Can you maybe kick us off a bit? Where do you see the opportunities and challenges in U.S.-China engagement on climate and energy today? You know, what do you see is going well, and where are the major sticking points?
Thanks very much for having me, Johanna. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me try to answer your questions. Perhaps by making 4 points. The first point that I want to make is when we talk about the relationship between U.S. and China in the field of climate change and environmental protection, I think the words that we use to describe their action, their interaction, are quite important. Different words carry different meanings, and some words carry very specific meanings in this particular context. For example, when we talk about U.S.-China climate cooperation, I think that tend to remind people who are in this industry for long the dynamics that we saw back in 2015, right? The high level, close interaction, kind of unlocking key political issues related to the Paris Agreement, but also the sectorial engagement, right, between the experts and industries on both sides. Another word that people commonly use is engagement. And that one is more neutral, doesn't necessarily prejudge the outcome of the interaction. And then, of course, given the more contentious bilateral relationship now, some people start to use climate competition between the US and China. I think the truth here is going forward, there won't be kind of one word to capture all. The US-China climate relationship is a complicated one, and it will get more complex going forward. So I think all of those words will hold some truth, but on the other hand, none of them can just describe or capture the entire nature of this relationship. And also, I think we need to examine, when a certain action, such as cooperation, is effective, and indeed, in which specific areas such action is needed or not. I would argue, for example, cooperation across the board between these two countries may not, actually be necessary to move the climate agenda forward. But on the other hand, I do see certain areas where the two countries would actually need to talk to each other and even collaborate, right? So I think that's the first point. The second point, if we take what the two governments have been doing since the Biden administration, particularly the interactions between the two climate envoys, as engagement, right? Engagement in the sense that they are talking very extensively with each other throughout this year. They're laying out each country's, positions and trying to find convergence. If we take that as engagement, then I think we have made some progress, on the diplomatic front, in light of or despite of the very difficult bilateral relationship. I think here, just to remind everybody, John Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, is one of the only two senior U.S. officials who have actually visited China since the Biden administration. If you look at the two sides' first face-to-face engagement in April in Shanghai, and the outcome of it, which is a joint statement. That joint statement, I would argue, is pretty substantive. It goes into a lot of the issues where the two countries did not talk about, did not share consensus, right? And I think for a U.S. audience, one concrete example that I can throw in here is it is actually the first time in any bilateral statement that the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities is now mentioned. And we all understand that the principle of CBDR is such an important one in the engagement between the US and China. So the absence of that, I think, is quite notable. And I think it represents to me some level of willingness or flexibility on the Chinese side. I think the same thing can be said on China's decision to ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and also the statement by the Chinese president at the April 22nd Earth Day Summit to peak coal consumption before 2025, and of course, the more recent Chinese announcement at the UNGA to impose an overseas coal moratorium. So a lot of progress has been made, and some of these are related to bilateral engagement. And then the third point that I want to make is, despite all this incremental progress, we will face great challenges in this bilateral relationship. Here, I don't need to tell everybody the harsh rhetorics that have been thrown back and forth between Washington and Beijing. On the U.S. side, trying to separate the issue of climate change away from the more contentious bilateral relationship on the Chinese side. Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs basically refuted that attempt. But in the spirit of being kind of provocative with, I guess tonight, primarily an American audience, I would argue that the biggest challenge for this relationship going forward is the U.S. domestic climate politics, right? A gridlock domestic climate politics. No real progress can be made or has been made, at least in the eyes of the policymakers here in Beijing. Really, other than the rejoin of the Paris Agreement by the Biden administration, of course, the U.S. introduced new 2030 climate targets as its NDC, and also in September committed $11.4 billion as climate finance to support other developing countries. But all of those actions would require congressional support, and the prospect of that is highly uncertain. So I think in the Chinese eyes, there's not a lot of credibility to start with on the U.S. side, which will make the 2015 style bilateral kind of joint progress or joint decision making very, very difficult, because there is simply not a quid pro quo in the Chinese side, in the Chinese eyes. And then the fourth and the last point that I want to make is, given all that I have said, I think the U.S. should understand with nuance its role in influencing or shaping China's approach with regard to climate change. Here, you often sort of hear two exaggerated views. On one hand, the argument goes, the U.S. has all the power. It could, if it wants, basically, help the state council write its 5-year plans. That's kind of one, exaggerated view. And then on the other hand, the argument goes, why do we bother? Right? China is anyways on its own path, and we will not have any, influence in shaping its trajectory. I think the reality would be somewhere in between these two arguments, right? And it is probably much more nuanced. I think it is always very hard to kind of quantify the impact of U.S. engagement, the impact of Kerry's trips. But I think the way that I tend to think about these issues is, if there is no international expectation or engagement at all with China, do we think, for example, in September this year, the Chinese side will make an announcement to not support overseas coal projects? My conclusion is no, we will not make such a decision, because at the end of the day, it is a multi-billion US dollar overseas business. I don't see the country as selfish as that, right, to simply abandon that. So the last point that I'm trying to make here is engagement matters. It has worked in the past, and it will have a role in the future, despite of the bilateral relationship. So with that, I turn it over to you, Johanna, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And thank you very much for those reflections. There's many things there I think we'll come back to, but I'd like to go ahead and turn now to Nan. Nan, you've been involved for many years in the more technical side of clean energy and climate change cooperation, including as a director of the U.S.-China CERC for building efficiency. This is one of the flagship U.S.-China clean energy technology cooperation programs under the Obama administration that had hundreds of researchers involved in R&D. Can you speak from your experience? What is the value of U.S.-China clean energy cooperation, and of course, what are the risks?
Yeah, so I think sure, just talk about the opportunity and the challenges and for the U.S.-China collaboration on clean energy and also climate change issues. And it's a very sensitive time and certainly, and it's tricky in figuring out approach or area for potential collaboration or cooperation. Um, Although and there are successful models, and Joanna, you mentioned about the CERC program that managed the building energy efficiency consortia in the last 10 years. So there are a lot of successful elements, and that could be actually potentially applied to any future collaboration. And so, for example, the program has been very successful attracting private sector and cost share and engagement. And that was originally designed by Secretary Chu when they initiated the program. And they really wanted to see real world impact through kind of commercialization, tech to market, accelerate that process. So we have requested to come up with a cost share to the Department of Energy's investment and on the one-to-one basis or even more. So it was a conscious effort engaging private sector and in the building space in energy efficiency and working with the Chinese. So that was a very important element because throughout the program, they've been deeply engaged in the research collaboration, demonstration, and even policy research. They demonstrated a lot of US benefits because of their participation. They've seen more market access. They gain more visibility and recognition in China. And also they were able to accelerate the technology in innovation by many years. And some of the collaboration our company partners have done with LBL and the Oak Ridge National Lab, and they, according to them, accelerated their innovation process by 10 years. And so that's quite significant. And throughout the years, we were able to attract actually almost 1.5 to 1 cost share in year after year on average. And so for the government investment and the $1 actually yield in more than $4 of return if we combine the same kind of contribution from China side. And so that was one of the key elements. And the second part and the important elements is that we collaborated with China, developed the projects. And so everything was agreed, signed. Some of the areas were really joint because we see strong mutual benefits. In some area, one country could be priority, in other country is a bit lesser. And for example, China really was interested in district heating, kind of how do we clean that sector and that end use. And so that was not a strong focus from the US side. And so in areas like that, we had a more cooperative approach. And so each side provides and support as needed and to ensure the other side could succeed. So that was the second part of the elements. So the other parts is really the demonstration projects. It was highly welcomed by, again, private sectors and even by our research community as scientists, because we normally do more and the desktop work. And by having demonstration building, real building, and we can test technologies, do instruments and monitor and testing, all of those, and to verify and whether the new technologies actually work and what their performance are in the real world. And so that provide us the first hand in the data to calibrate our analysis or research. And also, as I mentioned, is for a private sector, that was also very important, and to show how the U.S. technologies and can actually fit into the Chinese situation and how they perform. Anything needs to be modified or improved. Yeah, so there are these very successful elements of it, and the program, and then any of the R&D collaboration, and encounters the issue of the IP protection. And Joanna, you're the expert on that. And so for SIC program, really before we enter any of the collaboration, and there was consensus that we need to come up with some protocol that both sides need to agree to protect IP from our companies or from our research lab scientists. And so lawyers and government officials from both sides, both the US and China side, and worked extensively and probably over half a year to come up with this TMP, Technology Management Protocol. And so that was not easy. And everybody finally signed off. And we've been using it as really the protocol, and to make sure there's no dispute and no misunderstanding. So that has shown to be very effective as well. And throughout this collaboration in the last 89 years, we have never encountered any problem related to IP. And I learned some other CERC centers had a little issue, but because we had the protocol and the US side could go and talk with our Chinese counterparts, I think that was also resolved. Yeah, so that's another very important elements for the success. So overall, if I summarize and the benefits, and one is for the cost share and part, and for the $1 investment, we can have much bigger impact through the collaboration and by engaging industry partners. The second part is really real world impact through R&D and the development to demonstration and to deployment. And we actually have worked on codes and standards together. And that's another area all the US companies, researchers, and felt they really benefited, because having the voice in the standard setting, and it's in the more a level playing field, right? If we can have the voice and come up with standards that's stringent enough, they can help move the needles, and the US technologies can also openly compete, right, in the market. If the standard is too low, then the US technologies that are efficient or more costly, and probably it will not prevail. And that's a very important and the benefits. And then the tech to market accelerations through this collaboration with the industry. So that's another benefits. And yeah, so overall this IP protection. So those are the key and successes and the benefits I see from the collaboration model. There are also some lessons to learn for future collaboration between and the US and China on climate change issue. We can pick a different area. We can pick area that's less controversial, and then we can use this model. But paying attention to these few elements will be very important. So that includes aligning with and adding value to US industries is really critical. And field testing contributed to next generation technologies for all. And a lot of best results also coming from and some of the collaborative research agreement we call the CRADA, between US industry and the national laboratories. And this CIRCB model created this halo effect for US companies, and which result in greater access to Chinese government, market, and key influencers. And the partnership we have built and with Chinese institutions, that is beyond the valuable to all, not just US companies, governments, academia. And even though the program is wrapping up, it's ending this month, end of this month, and the partnership and will continue. And our scientists already publish a lot of joint papers, conduct the research with the Chinese collaborators, and so they will continue on those bases. Lastly is a lot of the market intelligence for both US and Chinese companies learn from CERC is very critical. So I can see these elements and could certainly be applied to future collaboration. Let's pick an area, for example, it could be building materials or zero energy, zero emission buildings, or some other areas transportation behavior. And many of those areas, there's no national security concern.
Great, thank you, Nan. That's really, really interesting to hear about your firsthand experience working with these technology collaborations. I'd now like to turn to Erica. Erica, you've really seen US-China cooperation from a variety of perspectives over your career, of course, previously in your role as S&T counselor at the Beijing Embassy, but now at the Information Technology Industry Council. Could you speak to where you see opportunities as well as areas of competition for the tech sector in China?
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for including me on this panel today. So let me begin by providing a brief introduction to the Information Technology Industry Council, known as ITI, and to the Green Grid, which are the organizations I currently represent. ITI is the premier global advocate for the tech sector. We are a global trade association representing 80 of the world's most innovative companies. And the Green Grid is an affiliate of ITI that has 35 member companies dedicated to optimizing the resource efficiency of data centers. And for both these organizations, China is always a subject of much concern and interest to our members. So as we are all aware, the US-China relationship is extremely complex, but also extremely important, especially when it comes to existential issues such as climate change. So during my time covering China for the US government from 2006 to 2014, the relationship was one of both competition and cooperation. And you just heard about some of the great cooperation that started during that time from Nan. And sadly, since I moved away from China in 2014, the political relationship has deteriorated dramatically. And this has made the operating environment in China even more challenging than it was before for foreign companies. So despite the deterioration of the US-China bilateral relationship in recent years, the goal of the tech sector still remains to try to find a balance among competition, collaboration, and pressure. So what do I mean by that? In terms of competition, the tech sector sees competition as a driver for innovation and growth. And in terms of collaboration, the tech sector sees collaboration wherever possible as a means to expand market access. And in terms of pressure, the tech sector views it as necessary for governments to continue to press China to allow foreign companies to be able to compete on an even footing with domestic companies in China and around the globe. The tech sector has adopted this approach because regardless of whether China plays by the same rules or not, it is clear they will continue to develop significant capacity for technological development, innovation, and growth, and cannot be ignored as a competitor or as a marketplace. So with that background, I'd like to begin by outlining some of the key priorities at this time for the tech sector with regard to China, and conclude by considering how these priorities relate to climate change cooperation. So first, our companies face real and persistent challenges in the Chinese market, including barriers to market entry and preferential treatment policies. Over the last 15 years, China has created a tapestry of laws, regulations, standards, and practices that collectively advantage Chinese companies and create conditions sometimes for direct and indirect tech transfer. Despite China's preference for long-term planning and strategic approaches to boost Chinese innovation and indigenous technology, as China hands well know, the Chinese government is not a monolith. Infighting and discord often mean that pressure from the Chinese leadership for agencies to issue regulations has added another layer of uncertainty and unpredictability to the Chinese market. For example, following passage of China's 2016 cybersecurity law, the tech sector has seen an unprecedented onslaught of implementing regulations, notices, measures, and standards drafted by numerous agencies within the Chinese bureaucracy, often contradicting one another. While China has reconciled some of these differences, the landscape still remains murky. So with that background, let me briefly touch upon the 3 priorities for the tech sector with respect to China before moving to the topic of climate more specifically. So first, the tech sector supports and promotes positive US policy proposals that stand to enhance US technological competitiveness with China. Second, the tech sector is focused on identifying Chinese ICT and related policy areas that impact US and multinational companies, and then developing strategies to influence those policies. And third, the tech sector would like to influence the implementation of the US-China trade deal to roll back tariffs and address priority tech issues, such as forced tech transfer. In terms of climate change, the tech sector is eager to deepen the relationship with key stakeholders within companies, academia, and associations in China to exchange information and foster alliances wherever possible. My personal hope is that China's climate ambitions will create space for positive cooperation, both for the tech sector and for the US and the international governments in China. I believe there is some room for hope, given that China has long viewed the transition to a low carbon economy as an economic driver by providing millions of jobs for Chinese, as well as by reducing China's dependence on foreign oil and gas. As I used to tell congressional delegations when I ran the environmental section at the US Embassy in Beijing, China may have missed the Industrial Revolution, they may have missed the dot-com revolution, but they are definitely not missing the Green Revolution. In fact, China is leading the global energy transition in many ways. In a few examples, China already has over 3 times the amount of solar energy than the US. China's wind power installations were more than triple those of any other country in 2020. And China makes and buys more electric cars than any other country by a considerable margin. Currently, about 1 in 20 cars bought in China is electric powered. And by 2035, many experts are predicting that almost all new vehicles sold in China will be fully electric powered or hybrid. That said, this doesn't mean that China is manufacturing and or deploying clean technologies in a green way. And China's continued significant reliance on coal is deeply concerning. As for the role of ITI on the climate front, ITI has a climate task force, which has gained momentum in recent months. I'm involved in the group, and I'm eager to explore how ITI might play a significant role in organizing the tech sector in support of climate goals. So to that end, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today and hearing ideas of what we might do to help promote increased collaboration between the US and China.
Great, thanks so much, Erica. I have a couple follow-up questions, but I would also like to get the audience involved in the conversation. So I encourage anyone listening who has a question to go ahead and submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be turning to those shortly. But first, I think, it's really interesting that, despite the challenges, which are clearly there and that many of you highlighted, I think each of you mentioned that there is value in engaging with Chinese partners on climate issues. Li Shuo, you said you don't think that China would have made the UNGA announcement about overseas coal financing absent US and other international pressure. Non, you mentioned, many benefits to technology development, co-financing, demonstration opportunities, market opportunities for US companies, and the added IP protections that may not exist without having a bilateral cooperation framework under which this collaborative research, development, and demonstration occurs. And Erica, despite I think the real concerns, from technology companies about the Chinese market, still clearly many opportunities there for engagement. So I'd be interested to hear from each of you. We're all very focused on COP26 right now, but really even looking beyond, looking out for the next few years, do you see areas for expanded US-China engagement that both sides are not currently taking advantage of? If you were providing recommendations either to the Biden team or the Chinese side, where do you see a need for new cooperative agreements or programs? Li Shuo, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, Johanna. Maybe just a simple and humble point. They should, both sides, both governments should just maintain the frequency of their policy dialogues after COP26, right? I think for people that are familiar with the international climate calendar, this year is a big year, right? We had the Biden Climate Summit, and then we're going to have the G20 and COP26 in a week's time, and these are major milestones for international climate politics. And it's easy to see intensive international engagement, US-China engagement in the run-up to those major milestones. I think the frequency should be maintained going into 2022. And I am also not entirely sure that engagement could be taken for granted, right? Just the policy dialogues between the two governments, the meetings between the two envoys, those could be taken for granted. And without those exchanges, I think progress between these two countries can actually be even more limited. So in a way, to answer your question, Johanna, it is not only or not necessarily about the two countries talking to each other or even cooperate with each other to have clear progress in specific areas, but just to maintain the channel of dialogues so that they make their own position clear to the other side, and also to let the other side know about their expectation, right, to the other side. I think that by itself is actually quite important. And I am not entirely sure that humble exercise could necessarily be preserved, right, in light of the very contentious bilateral relationship.
Thank you. It is actually somewhat optimistic. It's interesting to hear, that many of you, even though you're pointing out the realities of the current relationship, that there are potentially still opportunities and value in engagement. Nan, you started to speak about specific technology areas where you see, less of a concern about competition. Maybe you could elaborate again on where you see that there are missed opportunities for clean energy technology cooperation.
Sure. Yeah. So it's not just like the area that's less controversial, but even on some of the area that's really high impact, high potential, depending on what approach and angle we take, there's still a lot of things we could do. For example, the coal phase out. I know US is putting a lot of pressure on China, phase out, phase down. But in the country where the demand is just growing, still, even despite COVID, China's energy demand grew. Steel, cement, aluminum, all the production grew, and in 2020. And so compared with the year before, and so it's even more now. And so in the country, they're still developing, urbanizing, and using energy and emitting. And it's very hard for them to replace coal with clean and fuels at a scale. And of course, China already has a very aggressive target. We all know. But they build as fast as they can, like putting 60% of renewable and non-fossil, right, and in the power sector each year for the new. But there are still existing fleet. So we feel, and in order for the coal transition to happen, actually the just transition topic and it needs to be in place, because otherwise and how are they going to do with the jobs and employment on the economy, and they worry about. And that's something US also we have not done very well either. So that's the area I think we can collaborate. And if they know there's way and they can transition into, if they know people will maintain their jobs or even grow the job opportunities, then there will be strong will because it's beneficial to both sides. So that's one area. In the different sectors and for building sector and the carbon neutrality has the biggest potential to get there much sooner than other sectors, because it's all mature, commercialized technologies. We already build zero emission buildings today, and California has targets, and for all new and later retrofit, all become net zero. And many countries, states all adopted this. So we know how to do it. And it costs a little more, but that's where we can use policies and other incentives to really accelerate and the adoption for that. And China does not have the target. Even we know it exists and how we do it. So why can't we work with them and to help set a target for zero emission building that could even be announced tomorrow, right? It's not some other technology, it's not even invented. And so that's all there. So for transport sector, we feel in the past, the focus have been put on the electric vehicles. I think that will definitely need to and continue to grow, and even into the trucking sector. However, that's something China is also very aggressively pushing for. And they have, again, new energy vehicle targets and mandates, many of those policies in place. And then we understand there's could be potential sensitivity around storage, battery, R&D. So we did find there are behavior type of programs or patterns, smart kind of transportation softwares, and there are also other these areas, and China has not done it. US just starting, and that's another area I think US and China can also work together in. And there are also the hard to abate sectors like aviation, shipping, that requires more technology collaboration, whether it's hydrogen based and those some areas, and it could also be opportunity, because those will be the things one country alone and probably won't be able to do it by themselves or do well by themselves. The lastly is industry sector. This is the hardest to abate sector, and so that's particular in some of the areas, and none of us and have very good and handle of. For example, the industry heating, the cross-gun heating, and accounts for majority of the energy end use in the key emitting industries. And we don't know and what are the kind of measures or and technologies, both sides, right? Whether it's chemicals, whether it's cement, steel, and or many other sectors. So that's the area. Can we and work together on in some renewable thermal or other types of technologies to replace the fossil fuel now is being used to provide heat and high temperature heat, and in that sector. And or building materials, cement. There's no controversial sensitivity because they don't go kind of cross border. And so can we lower the demand and improve the and the construction method so we don't use much? Can we use alternative cement? Can we use fly ash and to mix with and in the cement? And then there are also technology, DRI for steel. There are a lot of these things we can still work on together, and both countries will find the beneficial. I think the notion from US side in the past is that, oh, we've been always providing technical assistance, helping China, and we're not getting anything in return. So these area, and actually there are areas China is leading in, and for example, the EV sector, and also even in battery. And there's a lot of these, and we can mutually learn from each other and to have much bigger impact. And then particularly in these hard to abate sectors where really we need to work together.
Thank you. I think it's really helpful to provide these concrete examples. Erica, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. I mean, you've managed S&T cooperation with China for many years. But where do you see, the opportunities, or do you think that it's really not, the politics don't allow it right now?
Well, thanks for this question, Joanna. And I think it's important. I would like to elaborate on some of the kind of the situation that Li Shuo alluded to in his opening question remarks. So I think it's important to have some historical context before touching upon the matter of potential areas for cooperative engagement. So first of all, we are all aware that the Biden administration is eager for the US to jump back into the clean technology race. My view is that this is where US-China competition might actually be one of the best things to look to that can lead to benefits for all. Unfortunately, what is less clear to me is whether the US will be able to reestablish a really cooperative approach to climate along with the competitive one, at least in the short term. So during the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry's visit to China in September, which we've talked about a bit, China indicated that the friction between the two superpowers will negatively impact cooperation on all issues, including climate. This is very discouraging given that the future of our planet demands that the two largest emitters lead the way for the entire world in transitioning to a carbon neutral economy. But when it comes to US-China collaboration on climate, my best advice is what Li Shuo was saying in the beginning. My best advice for the US would be to get our own house in order. China will be much more likely to take the actions we want them to take if we demonstrate that we are serious and we are investing in the innovative technologies necessary to bring about the transition. Let me explain why this is so important by reminding everybody of the longer history of the US with respect to climate change policies. So when the US government asked China to engage on climate action, China is looking at the US against the backdrop, the following backdrop. So the US signed up for the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change in 1997 under President Clinton, only to withdraw from the protocol 4 years later under President George W. Bush. Then in 2009, the US drafted the Copenhagen Accord to the Climate Convention and used pressure tactics to get China to sign on, with the indication that the US would pass comprehensive domestic climate legislation, only for the Waxman-Markey major climate legislation to die in Congress in 2010. Then, during my time in China, and culminating in 2014, after many years of convincing China that the US was back in the climate game, we got them to agree to sign that joint presidential agreement between President Obama and President Xi, which paved the way for the successful Paris Agreement in 2015. And then in 2017, President Trump came in and withdrew from Paris. So there's no question the US is now back in the ring, and we're again urging China to cooperate on climate. But from the China's perspective, why would China believe the US is a reliable partner? So I think that the only way the US will be a credible collaborator in China's eyes is if the US gets to work at home. And based on the history I just detailed, the Biden administration faces a major hurdle in achieving the types of bilateral cooperation like CIRC or the 10-year framework on energy and climate cooperation that existed when I was in China. There is little reason for China to trust the executive branch will be able to follow through on its climate agenda, no matter how much of a priority it might be, unless the climate agenda is supported by legislative action. Therefore, you can bet that China will be paying very close attention not only to what the executive branch does and says, but China will also closely follow congressional action on this issue. That said, the good news is that, as Li Shua noted, our international climate czar, John Kerry, has a really good relationship, which I was able to witness during my time in China, with the Chinese climate czar, Xie Zhenhua. In fact, this may be the only reason China is talking to us behind closed doors. And it may, possibly, as Li Shua noted, have been behind China's recent announcement about stopping coal investments overseas. But in my estimation, the chance of any kind of public cooperation, like the secret negotiations I helped facilitate between the US and China to reach the 2014 joint presidential statement in the run-up to Paris, is unlikely to happen. Again, this is a major dilemma, given that it is critical for China to increase its climate ambition dramatically if we are to have any hope of holding to the global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, in line with the climate change convention climate goals. This is why my best recommendation for the US government at this time is to continue to talk, absolutely, and maintain relationships on this issue wherever possible. And I think it's great that Kerry is leading that charge. But the most important thing the US can do to bring China back into a collaborative frame of mind is invest at home in the technologies and policies necessary to transition the US to a net zero emissions economy, while of course continuing to promote a level playing field with China. In other words, I think it makes sense at this juncture for the US to embrace competition. And as former Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu under Obama would say, make clean energy the modern version of the space race that we once had with Russia to reach the moon first. Race to own and build the technologies to make our planet clean and build them in a way that is also green. So making competition for who can lead the transition faster is a competition from which the whole world can benefit. And if China and the US are going in the same direction, I believe the chances there will be real opportunities for meaningful cooperation on climate will increase. So in the meantime, from where I sit now, my hope is that the private sector and civil society may be able to find productive ways to engage and help pave the way for both the US and China to take the actions needed to lead the world in addressing the existential threat posed by climate change.
Thank you, Erica. That was really great. And I want to come back to this issue of US credibility, because we have a couple questions from the audience specifically on this point. And Li Shua, I want to get your reaction here if you think this sort of fairly characterizes where we are. There's one question saying, is there really an appetite in Beijing right now for policy dialogue? Does the US government have to prioritize the reestablishment of domestic policies before we can ramp up track 1 and track 2 engagement with China? What's the sequencing there? Because of course there's a time element to all of this. And do you think we can sort of be doing both concurrently? And then there's another point from the audience about, the fact that much climate progress in the US really goes forward at the state level, not necessarily the federal level. The federal level, as has been mentioned, is, there's a lot of this sort of constant changing, of course, with election cycles in climate policy priorities. But is there a way to really be pushing subnational engagement among the state level, in the United States and Chinese provinces, to continue to make progress on issues outside the presidential relationship? Li Shua, I wonder if you could give us a quick reaction to this.
Sure, happy to, Johanna. I think what I will say is, on the sequencing question, we need to do, we need to do both at the same time, at least for two reasons. One is we don't have a lot of time, right, in dealing with the climate crisis. We can't afford any sequencing. And number two, if we wait until the US to get its domestic affairs in order, we might actually need to wait a very long time. I think what we really need to achieve here is just between these two countries to build apolitical consensus that that this issue, climate change, is indeed an issue of a different nature, an issue that the two countries should try to somehow set aside from the more confrontational and competitive bilateral relationship, right? To maintain the dialogue. I think that's something that we need to preserve. The first year of the Biden administration has made some progress in this regard. But again, as I said, and as Erica has already alluded to as well, part of this engagement depended very heavily on the key individuals on both sides. So there is a time limit to that. And so how do we kind of cement these channels and this mechanism, this political consensus? I think that will be a very, very important task for 2022 and going forward. With that said, I would also say that something that I found quite ironic and interesting, the premise of a lot of the US-China discussions is basically how do we get these two countries together, right? Holding each other's hands, or at least moving towards the same direction. But in light of their difficult bilateral relationship and also their difficult domestic climate politics, I think one interesting agenda going forward is, in fact, how do we help them forget each other a little bit, in the sense that how do we kind of desegregate the China argument in US domestic politics, and also vice versa? How can we focus them on the fact that taking climate action is actually in their self-interest? I think that's also going to be a very, very important topic, in a quite interesting and ironic way.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, and I think the timing of the lead diplomats on this is an important one as well. I mean, we've already seen China pull Minister Xi out of retirement, I think twice now, to play this important role. So, which I think is really one of the reasons why things are relatively constructive. We have just 2 minutes left, and I want to quickly turn it back to Nan to address a couple questions around the technology. Nan, could you really briefly just clarify what you meant about sensitivities and battery technology in particular, maybe what those are? And then in renewables, are there opportunities for cooperation, particularly at the business and enterprise level?
Sure, yeah. So I don't know for sure, but I think the sensitivity around the battery technology, number one is related to resources. And because, for example, lithium and some of new mineral be used in battery. As the whole world and moving toward electrification, and there will be increase in needs for battery storage for every country. And China is certainly one of the biggest. And they already is leading in many of the area, whether it's R&D or acquiring and the resources, the mineral for the production. And so there will be competition for resources. And as we're also moving to the full electrification or carbon neutrality, and think that's one. And number two is the know-how in the technology stage, because it will be critical and in fundamental and technology for all the sectors in the economy. And so that's where probably US feel a lot of competition, particularly as I mentioned, China already is leading in many of this area. So there's a competition. There's a very typical, I think, man side, and like if you win, I lose, right? And so I think it's important to figure out a way that's a win-win situation. But right now, I think those are some of the sensitivities. On the renewable energy side,
really quickly, sorry, we're out of time.
Sure. Yeah, so Joanna, you may know more. I don't see a whole lot of sensitivities. Actually, China's already very aggressively pushing for the target. And they're doing very well. It's just that they can't replace at the scale needed. So very quickly.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I mean, these are obviously very complex technologies with global supply chains, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how, how this plays out, particularly as the economic tensions between our countries, discussions about decoupling and what that means for the clean energy transition globally. But I'm sorry, we're out of time. It's been really great to have this conversation with you all. These are three people whose work I respect extremely highly and real experts in this space. So thank you so much for taking the time to join our community today. We will look forward to following your work. And then thanks to everyone who joined this conversation. And we look forward to holding more events on this topic going forward. Thank you all. Take care.